It was a brave man who first ate the oysters, said English author Jonathan Swift. No one knows who that brave man was, but that first salty bite eventually led to war in the Chesapeake. Conflict broke out over who had the right to harvest oysters and how, and who had the responsibility to protect oyster beds and ensure future harvests in Maryland waters. This led to murder, mayhem, the decline of the oyster, and the rise of a new kind of environmental police. Oysters once grew by the millions in beds on the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. Native Americans harvested and ate them for 7,000 years. European settlers arrived in the region in the 1600s, and oystering became an industry, the most important fisheries industry in the region for the next 300 years.
There were two methods for harvesting oysters. Tonging in shallow water was a traditional method that was environmentally responsible. Tongs were large rakes attached to 40-foot poles on a pivot. The average tonger worked in a small sailboat called a log canoe, harvested 8 to 25 bushels a day at a value of 34 cents per bushel. The inefficiency of tongs led in 1808 to the invention of the dredge, a scoop-like instrument that was dragged across the ocean floor. In the bay, dredges were used on two types of sailboats, a bug-eye and a skipjack. An oysterman dredging under the sail could harvest as many as 500 bushels a day. The captain of a dredge boat could earn a profit of $170 in a single day, about one-fourth of what most Americans made in a year.
The oyster population decreased after the invention of dredging, which was destructive to oyster beds. Dredging scrapes oyster beds from beneath, destroys them, and brings them back up to the surface. Dredging also harvested more oysters than tonging and used less physical energy. Dredging was illegal in Maryland from 1820 to 1854 because of how destructive it was. By the 1830s, the oyster beds in New England were disappearing and watermen came south to the bay. Maryland oystermen became concerned that New England oystermen threatened the oyster supply.
In 1867, the railroad came to Maryland's eastern shore, and new methods of packing and preserving oysters were developed. This increased profits and led to greater demand. In 1885 to 1886, nearly 6,600 licensed boats harvested 15 million bushels of oysters. 3 million pounds were shipped by rail to the west.
As a Maryland Observer said to Scrivener's Magazine in 1877, "Nobody tires of oysters. Raw, roasted, scalded, stewed, fried, broiled, escalloped, in pâtés, in fritters, and in soup. Oysters are found on every table, sometimes at every meal." Oystering had become the most important fisheries industry in Maryland. In 1898, the oyster industry employed 32,104 people, 28,811 of whom worked in dredging or tonging. Dredge boat captains made more than 100% profit, and with this increased profit, conflict broke out throughout the bay.
Historian John Wennerston says, "Fistfights and brawls were common in the waterfront towns. The Bay Country bred a fierce recklessness in men who pitted their lives against the wild elements of the Chesapeake. Many of these men believed they had an absolute right to harvest oysters, wherever and however they wanted. They became oyster pirates. Oyster pirates harvested irresponsibly and operated in three main ways. Some dredged in areas that were reserved for tonging, others dredged in waters where they were not licensed to harvest. Many over-harvested. They evaded the oyster police and battled them with guns."
With violence present and pirates illegally dredging in restricted areas, Maryland took action. In 1867, the state established the first oyster police to regulate harvesting methods by fining, confiscating, or even gunning down unauthorized harvesting boats. It costs around $20,000 to construct and arm police boats with the firepower to sink a skipjack. A license was required to dredge. The first licenses were issued in Somerset County, Maryland in 1854. To obtain a license, an oysterman must be a resident of Somerset County for 6 months and a resident of the state for 1 year. A license cost $15, and dredging without a license would result in a $72 fine.
There were many challenges in enforcing oyster harvesting laws. One was that it was hard to monitor all 3,000 oyster vessels on 2,300 square miles of bay. Also, some of the illegal oystermen were more heavily armed than other Oyster Navy boats. In 1884, a rebel leader rose by the name of R.P. Cannon, or El Mahdi, caused the most intense fight of the Oyster Wars. On February 19, 1884, Cannon and his three sons, Sylvester, Gabriel, and Milburn, sailed to Fox Creek and began to dredge illegally. The Julia Hamilton, an Oyster Navy boat, rushed to arrest the criminals, but was destroyed by the invaders. A fleet of rebel dredges rushed to accompany the cannons. They were then surrounded by 19 naval vessels. R.P. Cannon lost his sons and his rebel fleet, but escaped with his life.
The state of Virginia also had problems with oyster pirates from Maryland. This led to the creation of the Virginia Oyster Police. Maryland and Virginia disputed state boundaries for oystering, which led to political involvement in the Oyster Wars. The Oyster Police soon realized that their enforcement efforts were not enough, so they armed their vessels more and built faster ships for the police to help catch oyster pirates. By 1888, the tables were beginning to turn. The last serious battle at sea took place between 40 dredging vessels and the Oyster Navy boat McLean on December 8, 1888. McLean destroyed all 40 boats, but was damaged by crossfire. In 1889, Maryland's Oyster Navy found and executed R.P. Cannon.
Intermittent violence continued for years. On April 7, 1959, two friends from Colonial Beach set out to dredge illegally, and one was killed by the police from the new Department of Natural Resources. This was the last death of the Oyster Wars. On December 5, 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed the Potomac River Fisheries Commission into law, and the boundary conflicts between Maryland and Virginia ended. The Oyster Wars were finally over.
The Maryland Oyster Wars were a conflict of rights and responsibilities. Oystermen had the right to purchase a license and to either use the dredging or tonging harvesting technique, but they had the responsibility not to abuse that right. They could not dredge in restricted waters. They had to manage the harvest, observe harvest limits and seasons, and refrain from over-harvesting and destroying oyster beds. The Oyster Navy had the right to punish lawbreakers by imposing fines, confiscating the catch, and impounding boats. They had the responsibility not to abuse their power.
During the Oyster Wars, both oystermen and the Oyster Police often failed to balance their rights and their responsibilities. A powerful profit motive led oystermen to sabotage their own livelihood by overharvesting, and to clash violently with authorities. The newly created Oyster Police sometimes took their responsibilities too seriously and sank oystermen's boats. But the creation of a state police force charged with protecting a natural resource was a new idea in America, and many states now have police in their Department of Natural Resources. Sadly, effective enforcement came too late for the oysters of the Chesapeake Bay. Overharvesting combined with pollution and two serious diseases have killed off most of the bay's natural oyster beds and the oysterman's way of life. From October to March, only a few hardy watermen still harvest the oyster, which has become a delicacy for those brave enough to visit an oyster bar.
So stamp up me bullies and heave her around. Hurrah, me boys, we're homeward bound. And it's when we come to the old Salthouse dock. Goodbye, fare ye well, goodbye, fare ye well. Them flash little Judies to the pierhead will flock. Hurrah, me